Welcome. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it is a huge pleasure to welcome you to this critical discussion on the situation in Venezuela and the not just local, not just regional, but global reverberations of a humanitarian crisis. I want to give a warm welcome to Adrienne Arsht, who inspires us every day and whose vision not only makes this event a reality, but also the Arsht Latin America Center and the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. I also want to welcome the many diplomatic representatives who are here today and who will be speaking as part of today's program, and would like to give a special welcome to the members of the Venezuelan delegation who are joining us today: Julio Borges, Presidential Envoy for Foreign Affairs, Carlos Vecchio, our friend, the Ambassador to the United States, and Miguel Pizarro, recently named Special Representative to the United Nations. For those watching today's event, please feel free to tweet using the hashtag #ACVenezuela, hashtag #ACVenezuela. As world leaders gather nearby for the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly, this is a good moment to ensure this urgent issue stays on the top of the international agenda. After years of advancing freedom and democracy around the world, we've entered a new period of geopolitical uncertainty, great power competition, and there's actually been something of a recession in democratic freedoms since 2006, as measured by Freedom House. Democracies seem to be in retreat, and autocracies have been surging. And as autocrats seize every chance they get to expand their network of cronies and proxy states, the consequences are dire. And make no mistake, there are a number of countries that do not necessarily want to see Venezuela go in a more democratic direction. Propped up by a clique of autocrats and oligarchs from the Kremlin to Havana, Maduro's ongoing violations of economic, social, and political rights have wrecked what was once the richest, most stable democracy in Latin America. Today, Venezuelans' minimum wage sits at $7 per month. Nearly 4 million Venezuelans are malnourished. Survival is a constant struggle, and you know the numbers of refugees. In 2018, Venezuelan refugees filed more asylum claims globally than citizens of any other country. And the number of Venezuelan migrants and refugees is on pace to soon surpass the total number of Syrian migrants and refugees. Across Latin America, countries have taken the burden of the humanitarian crisis without sufficient resources to address the needs of the migrant and refugee populations. Colombia in particular stands out for its efforts, but it's not alone. Unfortunately, the scale of the international response to date does not match the depth and the breadth of the crisis in Venezuela and the spillover impacts in the region and across the globe. The stakes are simply too high for us to be satisfied with the status quo. We're here to affirm and reaffirm the world's commitment to finding a peaceful and democratic resolution to the Western Hemisphere's largest man-made crisis. At the Atlantic Council, we don't see any of these challenges as a cause for resignation, but rather as a call to action. The outcome of Venezuela's future will have generational impacts, most of all on the Venezuelan people, but what happens next will also have massive consequences for a world gripped by rising autocracy. Today's event convenes distinguished leaders from North America, Europe, and Latin America to provide renewed attention to the increasingly deteriorating humanitarian crisis within Venezuela, and to discuss ways in which the international community can address the middle and long-term impacts of the crisis on regional security, prosperity, and stability. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for working with us and many other communities to drive this issue. Now it's my profound pleasure for you to all give a warm welcome via video to the interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, The President's remarks will be in Spanish, so please all put on your headphones who don't speak Spanish if you need translation. Mr. President, we look forward to hearing from you via video.
Greetings to all those present at this forum. Thanks to the Atlantic Council providing us this opportunity. For us, every window is an opportunity to show the international community the tragedy that has now befallen our country. Venezuela is today victim of the worst economic and social crisis that any Latin American country has ever experienced. President Maduro has brought upon us a catastrophe that is only comparable to countries that are at war or have been devastated by natural disasters. Venezuelan suffering has to and must end. President Maduro blames the sanctions imposed by the international community on public officials who are corrupt and violators of human rights, when in fact we Venezuelans have been undergoing this crisis for years. Today, as a result of corruption and neglect of the economy and the domestic productive sector, the crisis has intensified. Millions are living in extreme poverty or have immigrated to our sister nations. You bear witness to the hardships narrated by our brothers who have now migrated to your countries and who have told you how we suffer, what our everyday life is like. The report presented by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, leaves no room for doubt. In Venezuela, we are living under a repressive authoritarian regime that violates human rights and condemns millions to live in poverty and face persecution. This situation must come to an end. We must stop the suffering of millions. While President Maduro continues to usurp power, the situation will continue as is or even become worse. Now is the time for the international community, but also for Venezuelans, to join a just cause that maintains unity among Venezuelans, the great majority of Venezuelans. Above all, it is time to show that just causes have the support that transcends any interest, that is, to defend human rights and human beings. We persevere.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Paola Garcia-Trufro, Deputy Director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center.
Please. You're next, sir. Mr. Ambassador.
Good on.
Si nos acompaña, por favor.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's always hard to follow an act like that, but we will do our best here today. Thank you again for all of you joining us, both in the room today and as well via our webcast. We're delighted to have a distinguished panel with us today to talk about this critical crisis going on in Venezuela, the role of the international community, and how we can all mobilize and coordinate our efforts to bring an end to the current crisis and really fundamentally end the suffering of the Venezuelan people, both in Venezuela and more broadly in the region and around the world. Our first panel will focus on the global reverberations of the Venezuelan crisis and steps the international community can take to address the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela and also to help meet the growing needs of the millions of migrants who have fled to neighboring countries in the region. Today, I also want to take a second to recognize two distinguished guests who have also joined us. We have in the room two brave Venezuelans who have been the victims of these abuses by the Maduro regime that the interim President Guaido was just making references to. So I just want to acknowledge your presence. Ms. Meudi Ocio de Alban, she is the spouse and widow of Fernando Alban, who was killed while in custody of the regime. So we're delighted to have you here, and we're honored to have you here with us today. I also want to recognize Armando. So thank you again for joining us. I also want to recognize Mr. Armando Obdola, who represents the Pamon tribe, who, like all indigenous communities in Venezuela, have been victims of the Maduro regime's human rights abuses. So again, thank you for joining us. And if you can join me in welcoming them as well. So we're going to dive right in. To discuss these important issues and resulting humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. With us today, we've got Ambassador Vecchio, Ambassador to the United States. Thank you again for joining us. Always a pleasure. We also have John Barca, the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean from USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
you. We also have Ambassador Edita Herda, Managing Director for the Americas for the European External Action Service from the European Union. Thank you again for joining us. And last but not least, we've got Juan Pablo de la Iglesia, State Secretary for International Cooperation and for Ibero-American and the Caribbean from the government of Spain. So thank you again for joining us. As the interim president referenced in his remarks, last month the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, released a report citing the grave violations of economic and social rights, including the rights to food and health, committed in Venezuela at the hands of the regime. The UN Human Rights Commissioner has also warned that if the situation does not improve, the unprecedented outflow of Venezuelan migrants and refugees will continue, and the living conditions of those who remain in Venezuela will also continue to worsen. So we're going to dive right in, and Ambassador Vecchio, I'm going to direct my first question to you. Having seen and lived through the deterioration of living conditions in Venezuela firsthand, I want to just turn to you to set the stage for us here in terms of what are the most critical issues that we as an international community must address in order to bring an end to the complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela and obviously the resulting migration crisis afflicting the region.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Paula. Thank you very much, everyone. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for doing this event in order to highlight the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. This is not about Maduro or about Guaido. This is about the suffering of the people. We need to stop this right away. We need to stop the assassinations by people like Adrienne or the people of the indigenous community inside of Venezuela. So we need to keep that in mind. And I would say I will highlight three issues regarding this crisis. One, the political one. We cannot forget that this crisis is a man-made disaster. This crisis has been created by a system implemented by Maduro. So if we want to resolve the Venezuelan crisis and to stop the suffering of the Venezuelans, we need to change the regime. We need to put all the pressure in order to facilitate a peaceful transition in our country, because it's the only way to attend the magnitude of this crisis. The second one, I would say, is the security one. As you know, Maduro is supporting the presence of terrorist groups such as ELN and now dissidents from FARC. Those groups have been involved in drug trafficking and doing criminal activities inside of Venezuela and against Colombia as well. So if we do not address this one, it will become more complicated in the future. And the third one is, of course, the migration refugee crisis, or the flow of people across the region, but also the humanitarian aid that people inside of Venezuela needs, because normally we forget this. According to the last report from the UN, 7 million people need humanitarian aid inside of Venezuela. And so far they have reached only less than $200 million to attend this situation, and only to address 2.5 million Venezuelans inside of our country. We need to highlight this. This is quite important. We need to highlight that the Venezuelan people inside of our country need more support in order to alleviate the suffering, but at the same time, we need to attend the refugee crisis. As you know, this is the most important refugee crisis in this hemisphere. It's the second one around the world, and it could become the first one if this situation continues as it is. So in our view, these are the most important things, and this has to be addressed not only by the international community, by us, because this is a movement led by Venezuelans that need the support of the international community. So the combination of people inside of Venezuela under the leadership of Juan Guaido as an interim president and the international community, in my view, is the key to force for a transition in our country.
So thank you for that. We're going to get to a lot more of what more can the international community do and what more can all of us who are here today and are obviously deeply committed to the cause can all do to do more. I'm going to turn over to you, Assistant Administrator. Speaking of the need for this to be a priority and the importance that the United States and the international community has now increasingly placed on the crisis in Venezuela, I think there has been an elevated awareness of the depth and breadth of the crisis, the importance, as you rightly mentioned, Ambassador, of the crisis for the region and more broadly for the global community. So the United States has obviously made significant commitments to address the growing humanitarian crisis in the region. Most recently in September 4th, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State John Sullivan and USAID Administrator Mark Green announced more than $120 million additional dollars in humanitarian funding for the Venezuelan regional crisis. So I want to acknowledge that and want to maybe take us ahead a little bit. How do you see the crisis evolving in the medium and longer term? And specifically, can you speak a bit about what the U.S. government is prepared to do to address the needs of the displaced population, both now and also in Venezuela, as well as in those receiving countries? And then further in the conversation, we'll get into the road ahead over the medium and long term.
Good. Thank you very much for your question, and thank you again for the Atlantic Council for having this event and trying to bring to light of what's going on here. It's extremely important, and we're very grateful for you doing this. I want to pick up where Ambassador Vecchio left off, kind of one of the premises of your question, the aspect of long term. There cannot and must not be any acceptable long term with Maduro in power. The civilized world cannot accept what is going on now as a status quo. As far as the numbers, it was said before that we all know the numbers. It's worth repeating the numbers again to remember the scale. As of August, the UN estimates that 4.3 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela now, with 3.5 million alone in Latin America and the Caribbean. The UN projects that the number of Venezuelans could reach 5 million by the end of this year. Since FY 2017, the United States has provided nearly $377 million to help provide basic necessities, things like food, water, medicine, safety, to Venezuelans who have fled this man-made crisis in their country and the communities that are hosting them. That's important to remember. In the short and medium term, we have to appreciate the impact that these populations of displaced Venezuelans have in their host countries and communities. That's why the U.S. government is also assists capacity building in exactly those host countries and communities that are providing food, shelter, medicine, and safety to these innocent Venezuelans who have had to flee the nightmare of Nicolás Maduro. But while humanitarian aid helps alleviate the immediate needs of many Venezuelans, it does not address the root causes of Venezuela's instability. Only political and economic reforms will end the hyperinflation, supply shortages, and corruption at the heart of this crisis. As long as the corrupt Maduro regime continues to cling to power and enrich itself at the expense of the Venezuelan people, the needs in the country will only grow, death and misery will continue, and more people will be forced to flee, further straining the region's resources. It's one thing worth remembering. We have to understand, this is not a leftist political regime. It is a band of corrupt thugs who have hijacked their own country to enrich themselves through their corruption, their illicit businesses, and preying upon their own people. In the long term, no solution can take root until the current regime is gone. The regime must leave in order for Venezuelans to start rebuilding the country. The interim government is doing a great job in pressuring, preparing for recovery in their country, and we, the international community, must be ready to continue supporting them.
So thank you for that. I'm going to pivot to the role of the broader international community as part of this response to the Western Hemisphere's worst humanitarian and migration crisis in recent history. Given the scale of the humanitarian crisis and the regional impacts, it's becoming clear that there's a growing need for coordinated response by that international community. So State Secretary de la Iglesia, I'm going to direct this question to you. Can you speak a bit about the outcomes of the recent meeting between the Spanish Foreign Minister Borrell and the Colombian Foreign Minister Holmes Trujillo, who will be joining us shortly, to discuss the bilateral cooperation and support for the migrants fleeing Venezuela?
Well, thank you, Paula, and thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to share this time with you. We, in Colombia and Spain, we do have a very, very close and very large spectrum relations that now go through a very good moment. And so we don't take much time to review that bilateral relations. We like to qualify as strategic ones but we talk very much about the situation of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. And I take the opportunity to really commend the tremendous effort and the extremely good way in which Colombia is facing the challenges that this situation poses. In fact, with practically the same amount of resources, they are trying to provide public services, health, education, to that new 1.4 million Venezuelan people which are now living, and all the rest of that crossing through the country and going to different, other countries in Latin America. So we were very impressed, in fact, by the way and the sustained willingness to continue to do so. I would underline that they are still with the doors fully open to the entry of new migrants, and they are trying to push the Quito group so that the reception conditions could be well agreed among all the countries that are also facing in a different scale the burden of new Venezuelan migrants. So that was the point we talked about mainly. And apart from recognizing the example, the global example that Colombia is giving to the world on that point, we also recognize that the prospects are not good, and the figures, the minister is coming better than he explained the figures than me, but the figures are really present very dark, near future prospects. And we agreed that it's certainly a crisis which is underfunded. And we also agreed that the implication of UN has been much less than expected. No? A crisis which is perfectly, can be identified, as it has already been done here, as the second biggest crisis of migrants in the world today, should have attract more attention in the part of not only the international community, we can speak about that later, but about the system of the UN. No? The idea of creating this mixed body with ACNUR and International Migrations Organization really has not been enough. It has not been, quick enough to react and to deliver. The appeal made was, the appeal made was only founded in about 30 and 35%. And so no institutions clearly with the capacity to deliver, no money to feed the engine. So we are rather surprised to see that that crisis has not attracted the needed and the deserved attention in the part of the system of the UN.
So we'll talk a bit more about that, but I do want to turn to Ambassador Haddad. Could you speak a little bit about the steps that the European Union is planning on taking and commitments that they are prepared to make to mobilize additional assistance precisely to that point? We all recognize that there's a sizable gap between the scale of the need and the number of resources that have been mobilized to date. And so again, coming back to the same theme, we all need to do more. So we would love to hear your thoughts where the European Union is and what more you're prepared to do.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting us. And I think it's a very important moment when we speak about Venezuela here in this week when the presidents are gathering at the UN. You have heard one of our member states, the EU has still 28, so I'm representing the 28, but with the presence and under control of one of them, which is the pleasure to be here with you, without any doubt. So we have heard the numbers, they are terrifying, of course, but the problem is, of course, that it stays in the continent. And we think it's very important to call the attention. That's why Federica Mogherini, the High Representative, agreed with the representative of IOM and UNHCR to organize a conference to speed it up a bit. That what Quito group wanted to do in December, and not only looking at the terrific situation and abuses of human rights and calling for the new establishing of rule of law in Venezuela, we really wish to contribute to these terrific situations. So in this moment, the International Contact Group is sitting and planning what will be the response, and we are planning the conference. The conference will take place in Brussels, the 28th and 29th of October, and we plan two parts. One part will be assessment of the needs, and the second part, pledging conference, because we see that first, it is very important to see what are the priorities for the countries which are the recipients of the migrants, and thank to everybody who helps. I have to say that the European Union also is a recipient, and the Venezuelans are the third nation in asylum application in the European Union for now. Imagine how high numbers are. And it's not only Spain who is receiving the migrants. Maybe one point which is also important is don't forget that the European Union is a direct neighbor of Venezuela. With all the islands which are in the Caribbean from our member states, and we have also, it's needed to say, many European Union citizens living in Venezuela, so that's also why we are so preoccupied about the situation, and without any doubt, the danger for all the Colombia peace process where the European Union was so much engaged in the past.
Thank you. So I was going to come to it later, but since you've opened the door, I'm going to keep going down this theme of the donor conference. I did want to ask both of you if you could speak a bit. Obviously, you're coming off of living your own humanitarian crisis, migration crisis in Europe. Are there lessons learned from that experience of receiving those migrants in Europe that are really informing your approach and your thinking, both related to the donor conference and more broadly, your thinking regarding how to engage and how to support those neighboring countries, which, as you rightly pointed out, includes yourselves in the Caribbean. But how's that informing your thinking in terms of the planning moving forward?
This me? Well, I'm really not an expert on immigration questions, but I tend to think that there are rather different ones. Our experience, strictly economic and clearly political on one side, and the situation which is prevailing in Venezuela with the Venezuelan migrants. But nevertheless, we have developed ways and means to share that experience, even though I insist the situations, the real situations on the ground is quite different. We have asked to be considered observers at the Quito group, and we have bilaterally developed, and I'm sure that the Union is doing the same in their programs, develop ways to share that experience we have in all the areas of administrative management of people which has migrated. But I don't know if I have the time now. There is a very important difference between both crises. No? In the Syrian crisis, the political track and the migrations are two completely separated tracks, which make much more easy to apply the principles of the humanitarian action. In Venezuela, the tracks are more confused, more linked, and that makes it much more difficult to organize a really huge humanitarian action according to the principles of the humanitarian action, the neutrality, impartiality, etc., etc. So I think that point makes quite a difference between these two situations. Sorry to be late.
Yes, please.
The European Union, of course, we have our special DG, Director General, who takes care about the humanitarian issues, DG ECHO. They are also present here in New York, and they are giving some replies to your questions in these days here. We already had prepared 150 million euros for the Venezuelan crisis. It's a huge amount of money comparing to other humanitarian crisis, the money what we are spending as European Union. And we are looking at 3 points mainly. Is the security first, health and food. Not only outside Venezuela, but also inside Venezuela. It's more or less 60% for inside, 40% for outside in these moments, but it also can change, and we hope that through the conference we can gain more money from other donors to see where we can, the best way, place this money and it could be useful. I think health is a very important issue, especially for women and kids. And of course, everything what has link with gender-based violence also. This is something where we will really focus our help from the European Union. Looking at the 2 main sources for the migrants from the European Union, as you said, it's very different to look to Syria and to look down to the African countries. And the approach is also different. And of course, in many cases, it's about the root causes, working with the governments to prevent the people to leave. It is a different situation here. Unfortunately, we are not so able to work with the regime. The humanitarian aid is not allowed so much to come into the country. There are certain conditions, and we are trying also, of course, as European Union to communicate with the regime and to try to get at least the food and medicines inside.
So I want to go back to something that we touched on before regarding the UN and the scale of the UN response and efforts to scale that response. So we've talked about some of the steps the US, the EU, Spain have taken to date, and more broadly the international community. But of course, the crisis continues to worsen and the need for assistance continues to grow. The scale of the international response doesn't match the depth and breadth of the crisis, as we've discussed. And I just want to put a finer point on that. The UN recently released the 2019 Humanitarian Response Plan in August, which appealed for an additional $223 million, as the ambassador has alluded to, which will assist 2.6 million people living in Venezuela just for the months of July through December of this year. All the while, the UN acknowledges that the Venezuelan crisis goes well beyond that, and as the ambassador has referenced, the number of people in need in Venezuela is actually closer to 7 million. So the numbers are daunting, and it's clear that we must do more. So, Assistant Administrator, I want to turn to you. The U.S. has historically played a central role in mobilizing the international community's resources and calling the world to action to solve some of the toughest challenges and crises facing the world. What's your message? What's the message of the United States government to the international community at this time as you look at the urgent needs and the growing needs in Venezuela, as well as the longer-term needs the region will face?
Thank you very much. I was just in Colombia and Ecuador a few weeks ago, and I was able to meet with Venezuelans who had fled just days prior and months prior. And I can tell you, holding the hand of a woman who had fled Venezuela just 48 hours prior, she's sitting in a hospital at Cúcuta. She received no prenatal care in Venezuela, scared for her health and the health of her baby. She's holding my hand. The first things coming out of her mouth was not, how's the conference planning going? The conferences are important, don't get me wrong. So the U.S. certainly supports those actions. We applaud the international community coming in together. We're on the ground right now helping out, doing what we can for the Venezuelans with humanitarian assistance and helping with capacity building in these receptor countries and communities that are dealing with the crisis. The message is, again, the civilized world cannot and must not accept the situation. Dealing with the regime to address the root causes of the migratory problem is rather awkward when the regime itself is the root cause. The hemisphere has never seen human suffering on such a staggering level. The international community cannot turn a blind eye to this human tragedy. In Venezuela right now, humanitarian access remains constrained. Nicolás Maduro has only allowed a minuscule amount of aid to be provided at a scale, not at a scale commensurate with the needs in Venezuela, and has made it extremely difficult for international NGOs to register to do their work. This, coupled with security concerns, makes it difficult for humanitarian organizations to respond on a scale commensurate with the enormous need created by this man-made crisis. Only a government that really cares about the well-being of its people will, with the help of the international community, be able to start restoring the systems to fulfill the Venezuelans' fundamental rights to adequate food and health services. The regime has neither the means or desire to do it. And in fact, it uses food as a social and political control mechanism. Having met with people who had just fled, talking about the famous clap boxes and even distribution, this myth has to be dispelled, using humanitarian aid for political purposes. This is not a regime we can work with.
So thank you for that. I want to stay on the point of where the gaps, and Ambassador, that you referenced this a bit about part of the initial effort going into the conference is identifying where are the greatest needs, where are the greatest gaps, either in terms of the system that's in place and the response that's been unveiled and implemented to date. So I want to turn to you, Ambassador. Maybe you could speak a bit more, because I think it's important, because I think, again, the human aspect of the suffering, I think, is critical. And I think we've heard food, we've heard health, but I think if you could speak a bit more about what are some of those urgent needs. And again, I think the UN system has really worked hard to try to ramp up and scale up its response. Again, a big part of that will rely on the international community to step up to the plate and actually answer those calls. I think if you could speak a little bit more, put a finer point on what are some of those critical issues where you see the greatest gaps, and if you could, if I could go a leap a bit further and go, where do you see the gaps? Do you see the gaps as distribution gaps? Do you see the gaps in terms of funding gaps? Where do you see, again, the greatest opportunity for increased action?
Yes, that's a good point, but I don't want to just move the point where it should be. Mm-hmm. In my view, we need to attack the root of the problem, mm-hmm. which is the regime who has created this situation. So let me give you this context as well. Recently, the interim president, Juan Guaidó, was involved in a negotiation with Norway as a country, as a mediator with the regime. Mm-hmm. We were looking for a political solution inside of Venezuela, mm-hmm. to stop the suffering, mm-hmm. right away, from the roots. And the regime decided to abandon that process, and we closed it. We presented a political solution to all Venezuelans to resolve the crisis. President Juan Guaidó put on the table a sort of state council, Consejo de Estado, in order to create a national unity government to conduct a transition while we organized a fair and a transparent election within the observation of the international community. And they didn't want to go to that option. We are blaming Maduro for closing a political solution in order to stop the suffering of Venezuela. And the international community should blame Maduro because of this. We presented a fair and a transparent solution to resolve the humanitarian crisis. So this is the time to increase the pressure from the international community. That's what we are, asking to the international community. We have the majority of the Venezuelans. And that's why I'm fully confident that we will prevail at the end of the day. We have the majority of the people of Venezuela with that spirit of change. We have the clear leadership of Juan Guaidó. We will mobilize the people in order to conquer freedom again and to stop the suffering of Venezuela. But for that, we need the support of the international community. So my key message for the international community is to increase the pressure to create the condition to facilitate a transition in our country. In terms of the suffering of Venezuela, I have to thank the international community for the support that we have received from many countries, including the U.S. The U.S. has granted more than $300 million to the Venezuelans, to the countries, to the international organization, to alleviate the suffering of Venezuela. And they have sent in 2 times the comfort ship to Latin America to attend the people of Venezuela who are in those countries. So we want to thank because of that, and also the Europeans and the main Latin American countries. But it's not enough. It's not enough. Again, I will highlight the following. The UN said that more than 7 million people inside of Venezuela need help, vital assistance, to keep them alive. So the UN is not ready for that. They said that they can only cover 2.6. So my message here is that we need to increase that. We need to increase that inside of Venezuela, inside of Venezuela. And the other one, which is the refugee crisis outside of Venezuela. Venezuelans who are, across the continent, across this hemisphere. We have close to 4.5 million Venezuelans outside of our country. It could reach up to 5.5 at the end of this year. And if we compare that crisis with the Syria refugee crisis, I mean, we're far away. I mean, the international community has granted more than 30,000 million to the Syria crisis. Instead, to the Venezuela has been very low. And they have allocated to the Syria refugee, each person, $5,000. 5,000 instead, in the case of Venezuela, doesn't reach $300 per person. So these are the gaps that we have inside of Venezuela and outside of Venezuela. And my message to the international community, this is the right time to work in the political solution in the long run, to resolve it immediately, but at the same time, while we conquer freedom again, we need to alleviate the suffering of the Venezuelans who are inside of our country and also Venezuelans who are abroad. So we need to take advantage of this National General Assembly here in the UN to highlight that the magnitude of this crisis is similar to the magnitude of other crises that have received more support, so that now has to be addressed in a different manner to alleviate the suffering of the Venezuelans.
Thank you for that message. Crystal clear. I think we all hear it loud and clear, and I think you've got in this room a committed and loyal constituents who will take that message and are prepared to actually take action to go along with that recognition of that message. I do want to latch on to one point that you made regarding the migrants who have fled Venezuela, because I think we need to address absolutely the needs of the Venezuelan people who are suffering in Venezuela. I think we also, as an international community, need to maintain a focus on the region over the long term, because I think, as we've discussed at length at a variety of other venues, the crisis, even if it will resolve tomorrow, yes, it will take some time for the reconstruction of the country. It will take some time to reestablish the institutions, the full functioning of those institutions to deliver on the needs of the Venezuelan people. And so I think I don't want to lose the thread of everyone, even if this were solved tomorrow, inshallah, everyone will not return tomorrow. And so these countries will continue to have these migrants in their respective countries for some time. And I think as we think about that next generation of Venezuelans of varying ages that are now in neighboring countries, we need to think about their needs in terms of health, education, and make sure we don't lose a whole generation that will actually be critical to that reconstruction of your country. So maybe I'll open that up to all of you, but maybe start with you, Assistant Administrator. Obviously, at USAID, you do a tremendous amount looking at the medium and long-term development assistance. I know you're already planning for it. Would love to hear your thoughts.
We're not just planning for it, we're doing it. So as I mentioned, I just returned a couple weeks ago from Ecuador and Colombia. So we have to applaud the Duque administration and what they're doing in terms of support for these Venezuelan populations. So USAID is proud, and others in the US government, we're proud of our support, not only humanitarian assistance for those Venezuelans themselves, but for the Colombians in terms of capacity building. I mentioned I was at a hospital in Cúcuta, Hospital Erasmo Meos. It's the largest hospital in Cúcuta. It's a 5-minute drive from the bridge that everybody's seen. So what USAID did, I was extremely proud to be part of a ribbon cutting ceremony for additional facilities in that hospital to help deal with the additional burden, placed on it by the fleeing Venezuelans. Again, I mentioned the woman I met who was pregnant. This isn't a FYI. About 97% of all pregnant women who are fleeing Venezuela have received no prenatal care, which by definition makes them high-risk pregnancies. So since 2015, that hospital, right on the border of Cúcuta, has seen birth rates go up over 4,000%. So that's just one example. So you have caminantes, who they're not just in the border communities, these are Venezuelans who go to Ecuador, Peru. I met with representatives from the Chilean government. There's a huge population. So what we are doing, and we certainly welcome the international community to join us, is to help the capacity building in these receptor communities. Because again, inshallah, the whole Maduro will be gone soon enough, but yeah, it will not be a binary light switch where everybody comes back immediately. So we have to help these host countries and communities with their capacity.
I'm going to give you an opportunity if you want to weigh in. Otherwise, I'm going to give Ambassador Vicky, I'm going to give you the final word before we close out this panel.
I would say, I mean, your point that you raised is quite important. We need to be ready for the future as well. We have been working inside of the interim government of Venezuela to be ready by the moment we take full control of the government in our country. And we have built like Plan País with a lot of experts and people inside of Venezuela, outside of Venezuela, and with many countries and private companies also. We have been working with them in order to develop a plan to recover Venezuela in all sectors. And this plan has been supported by all political parties inside of Venezuela, so it will bring stability to our country. And we need to be just ready for that. As we are just working in order to conquer freedom, at the same time we need to work with the international community in a plan to recover Venezuela, because this crisis will stay, a little bit longer. However, I think we are ready to create the conditions for the return of many Venezuelans and many companies and many people inside of our country to rebuild Venezuela. And these plans at least has three main ideas. One is bringing political stability, a democratic system inside of Venezuela, rule of law, separation of power is the only way to create political stability. We believe in that. We believe in political pluralism, and that will help to facilitate the process to open our economy and work with the private sector to facilitate, the boost of our economy. Of course, we will use the oil sector as an engine to restart our economy, but also from the social point of view. And again, this is quite important to bring social stability as well. This is about the people. We are doing this because of the people. We have 94% of poverty inside of Venezuela. And if we want to have a great country, we need to take that into account. We need to put those people in the same starting line in order to take advantages of the economic opportunities that we will create. This will be also part of our plan. But for that, we will need the support of the international community in the long run.
Thank you, Ambassador Vecchio, for those closing remarks. And with that, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists, Ambassador Vecchio, Secretary de la Iglesia, Ambassador Hada, and Assistant Administrator Arsht. Thank you.
Thanks.
With that, it's my distinct pleasure to invite my colleague Diego Area, who's an Associate Director at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, to the stage. Diego, please.
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Every day, when we open a newspaper or when we turn on the TV, even when we check on our social media accounts, we come across shocking statistics about the Venezuelan immense crisis that we're facing. But what we don't see, and what's harder to understand, are the stories around those statistics. The day-to-day struggles, the human impact, the suffering of millions. What those stories also show us and teaches us is what it means to be resilient in the face of hardship. Today, we will hear from a handful of Venezuelans in Peru who have managed to do so much with so little, the very definition of resilience. They will share their own unique and inspiring stories. Like Venezuelan National Assembly Representative Juan Requesens said before being imprisoned by the Maduro regime, Yo me niego a rendirme. I refuse to give up. My friend Juan Requesens, the people on this video, and millions of Venezuelans haven't given up. It's my hope today that you all and the entire international community won't give up either. It is my pleasure to introduce Carlos Escul, Venezuelan ambassador in Peru, that will tell us a lot of stories of shocking situation that they are facing, but also the magic resilience that our people is providing to the countries in the region. Thank you so much.
Imagine losing your family, your children, your job, your savings, your friends, your academic credentials, your identity. That's the situation today for more than 869,000 Venezuelan migrants who have arrived in Peru since 2016. Many have had to reinvent themselves. That's why Venezuela's embassy in Peru has designed a strategic support program for Venezuelans, together with major international and national cooperation agencies who have partnered with us to put into practice these strategies to assist Venezuelans in Peru. As the legitimate representation of the Venezuelan state here, we're trying to help all the migrants who have arrived in Peru. That's why we're working on several projects with international donors to support the Venezuelan community here. Many have left behind their dreams, their hopes, but what they haven't left behind is the desire to move ahead. So we're working on projects like Voliosos and Ven Emprende to help Venezuelans to pursue their dreams here. Ven Emprende is a program that seeks to help Venezuelan entrepreneurs to formalize their businesses so that they can thus be part of the Peruvian economy and create other jobs. And we try to connect private sector capital with Venezuelan human capital that enables Venezuelans to find work. This is the first job bank for Venezuelans in Peru. That's the program Valiosos, and that can serve as a model for elsewhere throughout the region. I arrived in Lima a year and a half ago. Because of the situation in our country, we decided to emigrate. We come from the region known as Zulia, where we eat a lot of plantain. We eat everything with plantain, and because of that, we came up with the business idea that involves taking advantage of the wealth and rich cuisine of Peru, and the business idea involves preparing dishes with plantain as the main ingredient. So plantain empanadas, plantain patacon, plantain lasagna. We like to bring the flavors of home to Peru. I'm a software consultant. I came here with a business, a company that hired me and brought me here from Venezuela. My business idea is one that could help a lot of people. This program is so important because it provides guidance to those of us who want to be entrepreneurs but don't necessarily know how to do that. Ven Emprende helps entrepreneurs. And I think this benefits not just Peru, but others. We need more micro enterprises that can grow bit by bit and compete in the market. I'm married to a Peruvian, so I came here as a resident. My business idea is already up and running, actually. It involves painting porcelain for dishware for restaurants and homes and individuals as well. Helping entrepreneurs is always vital. entrepreneurs tend to feel insecure, and their weaknesses can be strengthened by a program like this one. Many people ask me how I'm doing with this and they want to participate. I came here a year and a half ago. I came with my family, my son who's now 3 and my wife who's currently pregnant. We came with a dream for my family. We wanted to get out of the difficulties in our country. My business is Teque Cheese. It's a company to make tequeños, which are cheese sticks. Our vision is to place our product in all the supermarkets across this country. It's really helpful for entrepreneurs to have assistance. It would be great to have something like this in every country, because it helps with the issue of starting up a company, especially in a country that's not your own. Like many Venezuelans, we're here looking for opportunity, an opportunity to grow, to learn, and have a better quality of life. We came with our suitcases full of dreams, hopes, aspirations, and faith. My business idea is a pisco-based cream liqueur, and I have the product in the market already. We have the traditional flavor, which is just cream, but I also have mochaccino, coconut, carob. These 3 weeks have been fantastic because I've learned so much, because the whole process has been trial and error. I think it's helped me get a clearer idea of what business means, where I want to go, what I want to achieve. This is an excellent initiative, and I'm really thankful because it gave me a lot of great guidance. And it's a great opportunity that we got, and we hope that many more people get it as well. I think that Venezuelans don't take anything away. We have a lot to add. Ven Emprende has been a very important program for Venezuelan entrepreneurs in Peru because it provides the necessary know-how for developing a business plan and analyzing the Peruvian marketplace. This is a bridge for Venezuelans to understand Peru, and we're here to provide that strengthening of information through the workshops we hold.
That was quite a powerful video, and shows firsthand the very real people that we are here to help. I'm Jason Marzak, the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and I'm delighted to welcome to the stage the Foreign Minister of Colombia, Carlos Gómez Trujillo. Welcome, Minister. And the Special Envoy for Foreign Affairs of the Interim Government of Venezuela, Julio Borges. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Minister Trujillo is now almost 1 year on the job, actually just over a year on the job, and has an illustrious career before being named to this post. He served as ambassador to the EU, Organization of American States, as well as Russia, Iceland, and Austria. We are also, this event is about Priority Venezuela. It's also a birthday party for the foreign minister. Today is his birthday. Congratulations, Mr. Minister. Feliz cumpleaños.
Thank you.
And Julio Borges was first elected to the National Assembly in the year 2000. He served since January of this year as the ambassador of Venezuela to the Lima Group, and for the last now just nearly 1 month as the special envoy for foreign affairs. Congratulations on this new, very well-deserved post, Julio.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your time and your leadership. What we're going to do is this panel, this next discussion, next half hour, is really about further focusing on the need for more global support for Venezuela and for the Venezuelans and the countries that are bearing some of the many Venezuelans who have left. Minister Trujillo, I want to start with you. Colombia is the country outside of Venezuela most affected by the Venezuela crisis. More than 1.4 million Venezuelans as of June were living in Colombia. I saw the recent numbers from the Colombian migration authorities, expecting potentially up to 2.5 million Venezuelans in a moderate scenario by year end. And this is really an unprecedented wave of migrants and refugees. We just saw a video of Venezuelans who are living in Peru, but I'd like to take this moment here as world leaders meet only a few minutes away to discuss during this important week the Colombian government's policy of complete solidarity toward Venezuelan migrants and refugees, providing medical care, housing, public education, work permits, even granting nationality to 24,000 children born to Venezuelan parents in Colombian territory. Mr., what are the short and medium-term needs for Colombia to continue this far-reaching policy of welcoming for Venezuelans?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good afternoon to everyone. Well, this is a huge challenge for us. Since the beginning of President Duque's administration, we pointed out to the world and to the Colombian public opinion that the migration issue was not a Colombian issue, but a regional issue with a global impact. And that is why the first thing we did was reaching out to the region, telling our colleagues that it is important to harmonize migration measures in our region. And that is why we helped so much to put in motion what is called as the Quito process. And secondly, we came immediately to the United Nations and told the Secretary General, Mr. Secretary, we are going through a humanitarian tsunami. It took me 1 second to tell him that and asked for the appointment of a high envoy, which actually he did, and that is why Dr. Eduardo Stein, a former Vice President of Guatemala, is helping us. Besides that, we put in motion a public policy internally. We went to the Council of Ministers, headed by the President himself, and a public policy was decided. There are resources that has been assigned from the national level, regional level, local level, and we have been asking the international community to help us a lot. What is the situation now? The situation is that the number of migrants coming into Colombia is increasing every second. And this is not an exaggeration. Every second there is a new Venezuelan coming into Colombia. Every second there is a Venezuelan coming and asking for some service, health services, education services, and some other services. So we are very grateful because of the support of the international community. We are very grateful with the United States, very grateful with the European Union, with other countries that are helping us a lot, but we need more cooperation and more help. Let's take a look at the figures. This is the second largest in number so far.
Yep.
Migration crisis. First is Syrian crisis, 6.7 million Syrians out of their country. In this case, 4.3 million. And the number is increasing and increasing and increasing every day. How is the volume of resources that has been assigned by the international community in order to help recipient countries to handle this huge crisis? There was an international call launched jointly by the International Organization for Migration and the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees to get $740 million. As of today, less than 30% has been collected. But let's take a look at another comparison. A migrant from Syria is receiving $560 per capita. A migrant from Venezuela is getting 68.18 cents. You can see the difference. If we were to receive the amount of support that Syria has received, Syrians have received, we would have received $7 billion. I'm not asking for that figure. What I'm saying is that we need more. The situation is too challenging for us. We are doing everything we can, and we will keep on maintaining the same policy, humanitarian sense, solidarity sense, and a sense of historical gratitude. But the magnitude of the crisis goes beyond our capacity to face the crisis. So this is the call that I want to make here today, not without repeating, without saying again that we are very grateful because of the support that we are receiving from the United States.
And Minister, that call from the United, that was almost a year ago that call went out for $740 million. Yeah. And in the last year, just as you said, about 30%.
A little bit less than that.
A little bit less than 30%. Astronomical numbers. And again, an important moment as world leaders gathering here in New York, that this needs to be a focus of not just a Latin America issue, this is a global issue. Special Envoy Borges, in addition to the needs of Venezuelan migrants and refugees who have left the country, as talked about in the last panel, and Ambassador Vecchi was mentioning the needs for Venezuelans inside of Venezuela as well. What are those most immediate needs, and what is your call for the international community?
Well, thank you, and feliz cumpleaños, canciller.
Gracias. Thank you.
And well, I'm one of those Venezuelans that has been in Colombia looking for help and receiving help from Colombia. And thank you for all the support of Colombia in the case of Venezuela. Well, inside Venezuela, what we really need is to put an end on Maduro regime. There's no other way. If we talk about anything else, that would be a mistake. We have tried to create different programs in order to provide humanitarian help within Venezuela. That has been impossible. We have been talking about humanitarian help within Venezuela since 6 years ago, and the regime has been totally closed for political reasons to be open for humanitarian help. And I really think that that's one of the reasons we have to build more pressure in order to create an internal division and a final outcome in the case of Venezuela. And I really believe that we are in a very crucial moment regarding what could be the end of the dictatorship in Venezuela. And I really think that the path that we have followed this year has been successful. I've seen that pressure has made a very important damage within the dictatorship, and we have to increase that internal pressure. I have 2 points that can be useful as an example. Mm-hmm. I'm really convinced that there is a real division between the army force and Maduro's regime. This division is impossible to find a way for Maduro to join and to make closer the army force for him. And also, we receive every day different signals from people from the army force and very high people from the dictatorship looking for a way out and different kind of negotiation in order to produce an outcome in Venezuela. And I really believe that pressure has been a success, and we have to keep that path in order to really obtain a victory in the case of Venezuela.
And following up on that, what is your aspiration for this week? Your aspiration as world leaders are gathering, this is, as you mentioned, Special Envoy Borges, this is a critical moment to ratchet up the pressure on Nicolás Maduro. We cannot solve the suffering of the Venezuelan people. We can't help to reduce the number of migrants and refugees going to Colombia and going across the region with Nicolás Maduro in power.
Well, we're in a crucial moment for 2 reasons. First of all, and that's had to do with Colombia, the international community thought that we are fighting to a dictatorship. But then people has become to realize that it is not a dictatorship, it's a failed state. But most recently, people is aware that we are fighting against a criminal state. A criminal state that is protecting terrorism, drug traffic, and all of kinds of violent groups within Venezuela. And this is a huge change that has happened a month ago with these narco-terrorist groups start talking in Venezuela about being loyal to Venezuela, about being defending Venezuela, and Maduro is protecting them. I sent to Canciller Holmes Trujillo yesterday a poem wrote by Santrich. It's a poem to Maduro, I don't know if you read it, Ambassador. It was,
Jesus Santrich, a former FARC commander who's living in Venezuela.
and he wrote a beautiful poem about Maduro, telling that he's the new Bolivar, and we have to fight with Maduro in order to obtain freedom for Venezuela. It can be a joke, it can be funny, but it's a sad reality. This group are completely joined with Maduro regime, and also, and this is very important, with the Cuban regime. There is no way to change Venezuela, although we understand clearly the real connection between Cuba and Maduro. The second point is that we already finished the dialogue in Barbados. And the dialogue in Barbados was finished by Maduro himself. In two opportunities, he said that he won't sit again with us. He closed the opportunity. We put a very rational, democratic, and legal opportunity for a solution, and he said no. So what I expect this week from the United Nations is that we are starting a new chapter in which building a new pressure, mainly from Europe, it would be crucial in order to put a final pressure on the Maduro regime.
Thank you. I mean, all incredible good faith from the part of the interim government in those negotiations in Barbados, and as you say, no good faith from Nicolás Maduro.
Exactly.
Minister Trujillo, Special Envoy Borges mentioned the presence of Jesus Santrich, the former FARC commander, in Venezuela, which brings me to a pivot to security, and a pivot to the security concerns faced by your country because of Nicolás Maduro. The Maduro regime welcomes with open arms Colombian criminal groups, shelters, FARC dissidents, and the National Liberation Army, the ELN, who engage in illicit gold mining, run their drug trafficking out of Venezuela and other activities. It's recent documents from your government that there's over 1,000 ELN, probably much higher, that are currently in Venezuela. As well, there's recently leaked documents that show that the Venezuelan armed forces are providing weapons and ammunition to Colombian criminal groups. And then earlier this month, Nicolás Maduro also announced he would be sending 150,000 troops to the Colombian border. What can world leaders do, again, this week, with this renewed focus on this need for renewed push and focus for democratic transition in Venezuela? What can world leaders do to help to protect Colombia's security and sovereignty in the face of Maduro's harboring of criminal groups intent on attacking Colombia?
Several things to be said. First of all, this is a great opportunity to let everybody know the immense challenge that the region is facing, not only Colombia. Of course, we are a border country, and it is clear the amount of risks and dangers that we are facing. Secondly, this is a good chance of the international community again to be aware that the best thing that can be done is increasing the support to Juan Guaidó, to increase the international recognition to Juan Guaidó, to increase the pressure, to increase sanctions, to put even more pressure on that regime. That cannot be stopped. If someone thinks that the best solution is to keep on doing that, is going into a huge mistake. That will only help the dictatorship. That will only help Maduro. So the international community has to be aware that the immense challenge to democracy, that the immense challenge to international security, peace and stability, that the Maduro regimes put to the world as a whole has to be faced from the international perspective with more international support and more recognition to President Juan Guaidó. Secondly, by doing that, the international community will be helping not only to restore democracy in Venezuela and to lead a path into more peace and stability in the world. It will be helping Colombia because the links, and you know that very well, Mike, because the links of Chavez regime and Maduro regime with narco-terrorist Colombian organizations is a long story. I had a chance recently in the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States to denounce again such a kind of links. And I remember the regional community, the story from 2002. I showed again all the evidences, all the facts, all the proofs that the international community in Colombia has about those links. And I went further in order to deal in detail with a recent development, which I am going to explain to you in more detail if you allow me to do so, because
please go ahead.
You mentioned some names. There are two guys that used to belong to the former FARC group. Those guys are named alias Santrich and alias Ivan Marquez. The guys never deliver on the commitments that they made. They never presented themselves before the special jurisdiction for peace. They never helped to know the truth. They never deliver on the commitment to repair victims. What is going on? What is going on is that one of them was filmed making a deal to export cocaine to the United States. The name is Santrich. Once he did that, the guy went to jail. Then he went out of jail. Then he went and took his post as a member of the lower house, which is one of the commitments made by the former president and FARC. And finally, the guy disappeared. So who is him? A fugitive, a guy that is investigated by links with narco-trafficking, a guy that left the place where he was in order not to be caught, in order not to be extradited to the United States. So the guy is a fugitive. And in the same operation, the nephew of the he called himself Ivan Marquez, was caught and is now in the United States under the status of protected witness. And he's sharing with the authorities all the links of Ivan Marquez with narco-trafficking. Those two guys went out and said that they are forming a new group. That is not a new guerrilla group. It's a narco-trafficking organization which has the support of the regime of Nicolás Maduro. So we are facing a new threat coming out of Venezuela, coming out of the Maduro's regime, coming out of the presence in that country because the regime has invited them to go there. That is doing a lot of harm to Colombia, is doing a lot of harm to the region, and is doing a lot of harm to democracy as a whole. So that is the situation today. What can, coming back to your main question, what can the international community do? Allow me to repeat that, because this has to be said and repeat once and again. We need more recognition to Juan Guaidó. We need more support to democratic fighters in Venezuela. We need more support to the effort, the huge effort that the Lima Group is doing. We need to strengthen the Lima Group. We need to be closer to the European Union. We need to be closer to other democracies in the world, because this is a common fight. But this has to be a Latin American solution. The best thing to do is asking our friends, because they are friends and they are democracies, European democracies, to support the effort that is being done by the Lima Group. That is my answer. More support, let me tell you again, more support. And more recognition to Juan Guaidó. We need more countries to recognize Guaidó. That is the only way to get to a point in which Venezuela can live again in democracy and freedom.
Thank you very much, Minister Trujillo. Minister, I think your answer also explicitly laid out why what is happening in Venezuela is not just a Venezuela issue, it's not just a Venezuela-Colombia issue, it is not just a regional issue, it is a global issue with the international criminal tentacles of Venezuela reaching across the world. Special Envoy Borges, as the foreign minister just said, the Maduro regime has growing links with drug trafficking, terrorist organizations, alliances with totalitarian and dictatorial governments. Beyond these domestic and regional implications, how is the growth of this criminal enterprise in Venezuela threatening the broader international community? Why do we need more international community members to be focused, laser focused, on a resolution to the crisis in Venezuela?
I think you are completely right, Jason. And one of the most important challenges that we have is to put the spotlight on that issue. And as I told you, we have to tell the truth and underline that Maduro is a criminal state. When we have the meetings in the Lima group, it's really amazing how you can have conversation with different countries. It's not only the case of Colombia. You see in Central America, in Chile, in Argentina, in Ecuador, in each country there is a concrete experience of Maduro financing and subverting democratic order. Real people and real organizations that are working, undermining democracy all over the region. The Foro de Sao Paulo that happened in Venezuela 1 month ago had a very clear answer, and that was the appearance of this narco and terrorist group in the case of Colombia. But we have many different phases of this kind of group acting, and not only in America. Not only in America, we have information from Europe, for example, Germany, how this increase in drug traffic in Venezuela passed through Africa and then to Europe, financing also radical groups that has connection with terrorists in North Africa and Europe. And we have to be very clear. This is a threat not only for the region, it's a global threat, and we have to deal with a lot of strength and to be very clear that the worst things that can happen with Venezuela is that anything happen. We cannot be accustomed that there is just a problem that is in America. We have to put all the strength, as Canciller Trujillo said, all the support in Guaidó administration, all the support in Venezuelan people, and be very clear, we are close to a solution, we are close to an outcome in Venezuela, and we have a real incredible achievement this very year, and we can win finally a victory if we are able to, with the leadership of the region and all the free world, put the internal pressure and the external pressure for an outcome in Venezuela.
I have one last question, same question for both of you before turning over to Damon and closing remarks here. The Atlantic Council, we like to do a lot of perspective, we like to do futures work. So I'm going to ask a question along that regard is, what might happen 1-2 years down the road if global leaders do not actively help Venezuela, Colombia, and the rest of the region? If the calls to action, Mr. Trujillo, Special Envoy Borges, that you are making today, if world leaders don't heed those calls, money assistance doesn't come into Colombia, more recognition of Juan Guaidó does not come in, what does that scenario for each of you look like 1 or 2 years down the road?
Well, in my opinion, there is no possibility that we should see Maduro in power 1 or 2 years ahead. That's impossible. But where we have to be aware that right now, if we don't make the final steps in order to increase pressure and to build all the options that we have for the future in order for rebuilding Venezuela, the situation could be in a very dangerous scenario in which everything could be out of control. Not only migration. Migration is the most visible situation, is the most painful situation, but in my view, there are other things more invisible, like drug traffics, guerrilla groups, organized crime, that if we do not deal this with all the strength, all the situation could be out of the control of the whole region. And that's the most important strength that we have right now.
Minister.
No, I fully agree with what Julio has said. And let me tell you one more thing from a different perspective, but the same reason of being. World democracies has to invest in democracy. World democracies has to invest in freedom. World democracies has to invest in market economy. World democracies has to invest in creating the conditions for democracy and freedom to flourish. So that is to say that today, the highest duty of world democracies is investing in democracy and freedom so that Venezuela can live in a different situation in which they are living now. If world democracy doesn't invest today, doesn't act today as they should, they will be serving tyrannies and dictatorship. That would mean losing completely the basis that we defend as Democrats. So my new call, besides the call that I have already made, is to the world democracy to invest in democracy and to invest in freedom.
Julio, final remark.
Well, I would like to make a final remark, but in Spanish, if you allow me. Hace un año estábamos Carlos Vecchio y mi persona y muchos de ustedes trabajando aquí en la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas con todo el proceso que se veía venir de la finalización del régimen de Maduro y su periodo presidencial, denunciando la elección del 20 de mayo como una elección falsa y buscando el reconocimiento del Parlamento. Y afortunadamente muchos de ustedes nos apoyaron en toda esta lucha. Hace un año estaba con nosotros Fernando Albán y quiero reconocer hoy quien está acá a Meudi Osío, su esposa. Fernando Albán, que estuvo con nosotros hace un año acá, volvió a Venezuela, fue puesto en la cárcel y fue asesinado por el régimen de Maduro. Meudi, Fernando, el mejor homenaje que le hacemos todos, y ustedes saben que era mi hermano personal, mi mano derecha, es recordarlo siempre por la lucha de nuestro país y como un símbolo de lo que significa la Venezuela que será libre y que tantos ustedes, como Fernando y como tantos amigos, hemos pasado por exilio, por cárcel, por torturas y en este caso por muerte. Donde esté Fernando, esta lucha también es para ti y para toda Venezuela. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muchísimas gracias, enviado especial Julio, otra vez Meudi, nuestro apoyo contigo, con todo, ¿no? I want to say at the end just one quick comment, which is cuenta con el apoyo total del Atlantic Council. Count with the full support of the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council, we have been working for years on accelerating a peaceful democratic transition, and this is a priority not just for the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center that I direct, but for the organization as a whole. And I can't thank you enough for both of your leadership, all the Venezuelans in the room, and all the other diplomatic representatives who are here. With that, I want to thank you again and thank everybody here, and now turn it over to Damon Wilson, the Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council, who will provide us with a couple of closing thoughts. Damon.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you. I want to just close briefly here, but first, thank you for your words just now. I think what we've heard from both of you, Mr. Minister, Special Envoy Boris, is a sense of absolute clarity about what's at stake, what our responsibility is, and calling on us not to be a sense of despair from what we see, but a call to action. And that's what animates, I think, the Atlantic Council, the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and our work. Venezuela is on the front line of freedom. We need to invest in that freedom and democracy, as you said, Mr. Minister. I think today's conversation captured beautifully that the security, prosperity, and stability of the Western Hemisphere is under threat by a criminal narco regime, and the scale so far of the international response does not match the depth and breadth of the crisis. So I think for all of us, the way the Atlantic Council works is we build communities of influence that can work in common cause. How can we step up our collective effort to defend freedom, democracy, respect for human rights, not just in Venezuela, but more broadly through the region and the world? This has long ceased to be a Venezuela problem. And the outcome of this crisis will not only determine the country's future, but the prosperity, growth, and development for the region. It's also an opening salvo of an era of great power competition. So as Jason said, for the Atlantic Council, this isn't a project, this isn't an event, this isn't a gathering. We have purpose, we're on a mission. This is a strategic priority for the Council. This team will not rest until we figure out how to play our part in finding a peaceful solution to the crisis that restores peace and prosperity to the Venezuelan people who have long suffered. I want to thank our team. I want to thank Foreign Policy, Yahoo Finance. I want to thank Adrienne Arsht for her leadership on this, Melanie Chin on our board, a driving force on these issues, our partners in stabilization, the Assistant Secretary, Denise Natalie, thank you for your engagement. Other officials we have from the European Union, from the US government, from the region in particular, and especially for all of the Venezuelans who are fighting this fight every day. We stand with you, we want to support you, and we'll stand with you until this cause is done and you have freedom in your country. Thank you so much for coming today, and stay engaged with our work on Venezuela, #ACVenezuela. Please stay part of this campaign. Thank you.